Man is the supreme talisman. Lack of a proper education hath, however, deprived him of that which he doth inherently possess. Through a word proceeding out of the mouth of God, he was called into being. By one word more, he was guided to recognize the source of his education. By yet another word, his station and destiny were safeguarded. The great being saith, "Regard man as a mine, rich in gems of inestimable value." Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. If any man were to meditate on that which the Scriptures, sent down from the heaven of God's holy will, have revealed, he would readily recognize that their purpose is that all men shall be regarded as one soul, so that the seal bearing the words, "The kingdom shall be God's," may be stamped on every heart, and the light of divine bounty, of grace and mercy may envelop all mankind. Baha'u'llah.
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. Just a reminder to please keep all your questions until after the talk. We're so excited to have Dr. Anthony Outler with us today, and his topic is Education for Liberation, a Bahá'í Perspective. Dr. Anthony Outler, PhD, currently serves as a middle school assistant principal in Decatur, Georgia. He has worked as a K-12 educator in predominantly Black schools in the Atlanta area for the past 17 years. He earned his undergraduate degree and his PhD in educational policy studies with a concentration in social foundations of education from Georgia State University. His work in schools is an extension of his community activism that is concerned primarily with using culturally responsive, emancipatory educational practices to empower youth to transform their communities. He believes that the purpose of education is to empower youth to identify, resist, and ultimately abolish oppressive systems and institutions in order to build a better world. In addition to his work with young people, Dr. Outler also works with adult learners as a faculty member for the Wilmette Institute course, Anti-Black Racism in the United States. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Outler.
All right, thank you so much. Pamane, am I saying that correctly?
Paymane, almost.
Paymane, okay, got it, all right. Definitely glad to be here. Good afternoon, glad everyone who's here able to join us this afternoon. I'd like to thank Armin for inviting me out to be a part of this wonderful speaker series. And as we were kind of talking before we got started, I'm finding out this has been going on about 4 or 5 months. And so I'm just definitely glad to be part of this series. And so today, again, I want to spend some time today talking to you about this topic this idea of education for liberation. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As you heard, as I was being introduced, all of my career has been spent in education. So right now, about 18 years professionally, but I was actually doing a lot of this work at the grassroots level in the community in terms of tutorial programs, junior youth programs that I was doing even before I became an educator. So I see my work as an educator as part of my purpose here on earth, a charge to keep I have, so to speak. So when I think about this whole idea of educational liberation, is within the context of my own schooling experiences and the context of my work, where a lot of the work that I do is in the midst of a system that's really designed for miseducation, right? Designed for education for subjugation, not necessarily an educational system that's designed to elevate individuals and to ensure the best outcomes, particularly when we begin to look at educational outcomes for students of color. And as you heard in our introduction, That's primarily the group that I've worked with in the Atlanta area. And I deliberately and intentionally choose to work with that population of students due to the urgent need for educators to address the needs of Black students and Black communities here in the United States. We're going to begin by just talking about our current system of education, right? We're going to explore some of the things, some of the elements that are plaguing our current system. And then we're going to move towards offering a new framework, right? So what I'm calling this education for liberation, a new framework that's grounded in the teachings of the Bahá'í Faith, all right? And so with that, I'm going to share my screen here. I have a PowerPoint, so that will kind of guide our conversation today. And so let me get my share on. All right. So, all right, we're good now. All right, so I want to start off here with this quotation from Horace Mann, all right? So Horace Mann, who is known as the father of the common school, right? Or the father of American education. This is one of the famous quotations that he's known for, right? As we talk about education, or we conceptualize education in the United States, it's been known or classified or characterized as the great equalizer, right? So Horace Mann says this, he says, education then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is the great equalizer of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I began to just really analyze this quotation, right? When we look at this whole idea of the great equalizer of the conditions of men, what this brings to mind for me is that education is supposed to be this thing. If everyone is exposed to a quality education, then it should equalize our condition, right? There shouldn't be any extremes of wealth and poverty. There shouldn't be these inequities in our society, right? It should be, hey, we all went to the schools under the auspices of the same educational institution in the United States. So ultimately, we should have, there should be this balance based on the amount of effort we exerted in our educational experience. And this ultimately should balance out or be the balance wheel of our social order or our social machinery, right? So this is the ideal, right, upon which our educational system stands, right? So this is what is out at this particular point, the equivalent of a platitude, this thing that's really stated in terms of the nature of our educational system. And not only that, this statement actually buttresses the ideal of the United States being a meritocracy, right? Meaning this being a land that if one goes to school, gets good grades, works hard, he or she has an opportunity to succeed and have the same level or equal degree of success, no matter his or her race, gender, class, none of those things withstanding. Everyone should have an opportunity to, based on how hard they work, to enjoy the same outcomes. It also supports the converse, that if one is unsuccessful, then that means that they did not work hard. They did not get good grades. They did not value education, or otherwise did not take advantage of the opportunities they were granted in the land of the free. And I know in my work, I hear this all the time, as students are in class, I hear teachers proclaiming the same things. Many of us were kind of fed this same narrative, right? Growing up, it's like, hey, particularly you don't want to wake up, you don't want to do your homework. Hey, you got to go to school, right? Go to school. Why? So you got to get good grades, get a good job, go off to college, get a good job, all these things. So this has been the mantra or the thing that we've all kind of framed our educational experiences around. The founding fathers of this country, right, supported this whole idea of America as this meritocracy, right? Where in the Declaration of Independence is written, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So my question here is this, right? As we're looking at this whole idea of education as the great equalizer, and this whole idea of America being a meritocracy, if all men are created equal, and based on the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, everyone has the right to a free, appropriate public education, then how do we explain statistics like these, right? So let's take a look. This is our current reality, right? These are some of the current realities of environments that I've worked in throughout my career. Black students are more likely to be held back despite mounting research that shows holding back children doesn't benefit them socially or academically. Nearly half of the nation's African-American students attend high schools in which graduation is not the norm, compared to 11% of white students, right? And I'm talking about education being this great equalizer. Let's keep that in mind. Black preschool students are suspended at a higher rate than white preschool students, right? We're talking about students, 3 to 4 years of age being suspended from school. Black students entering kindergarten for the first time score lower than their white counterparts in reading, mathematics, science, cognitive flexibility, and approaches to learning every category tested. 88% of African-American 8th graders read below grade level compared to 62% of white 8th graders, right? So I want us, I'm reading these, of course, I'm not going to read to you throughout this whole thing, but I do want us to really pay close attention to these stats. The 12th grade reading scores of African-American males are significantly lower than those for men and women across every other racial and ethnic group. It goes on. 1 in 4 Blacks, 1 in 4 Native Americans, and 1 in 5 Hispanics are classified as poor. By contrast, only 1 in 10 whites and 1 in 10 Asians are poor. The employment rate for African-American males has been 11 to 15 percentage points lower than whites in every month since January 2000. Blacks are 2 to 3 times more likely than white to suffer from hypertension and diabetes, leading in turn to higher rates of cardiovascular disease. Less than half of Black families live in owner-occupied housing. Again, we see the housing disparities here. And finally, right, in terms of our current pandemic, COVID-19, we're seeing that there are a disproportionate number of Black and American Indian people who are being impacted by this virus. So there's disproportionalities there as well. So now, and I'm actually going to elicit some feedback from the participants here, right? If you will. I know this was, hopefully I can do this kind of exchange with you. But I want to ask you a question, right? Same question that I was asked when I was exposed to statistics like these. We did an exercise in a course. I was taking a course during my graduate studies in a class with Dr. Joyce King. Dr. Joyce King is a leading urban educational scholar at Georgia State University. And she showed us statistics like these during her class. It was the first day of the class. The class was called The Sociology of the Inner City Child. And she showed us these statistics and she asked us a question. She said, very simple yet profound question that I want to pose to this group here. And the question is, how did our society get to be this way? Right? So we know all men are created equal, education is a great equalizer, but then we have statistics like these, right? So the question is, how did our society get to be this way? And what I'll do is allow people to just put in the chat some of your thoughts, and I will go through some of those. Hopefully I can see the chat. So I'm not going to necessarily have you unmute, but just if you would just chat in the chat, just some of your thoughts in terms of how did our society get to be this way. So just as you're doing, right, we all sat down and she gave us a moment to jot down our responses, right? So I looked around the room, people were writing things down in terms of, what they thought. And then there was a moment for us to share, right? She allowed everybody who wanted to share out. And I remember, as the share out began to happen, I remember students sharing sentiments such as, our society get to be this way because the Black community does not value education, right? There was another response. Black parents don't read to their children the way that they should, during the time before they enter school, so that impacts the literacy rates. Black kids don't care about school, right? Was one of the responses as well. And in the midst of all this, there were a few of us in the class who raised our voices, and we offered a kind of different type of perspective, right? And ultimately, as I look in the chat here, the things that we raised were pretty much congruent to some of the things that you guys are saying here. So for example, in the chat, and I'm reading here from, you know, the information that we've gained from one another here, we see response that our society got to be this way due to institutionalized racism, due to the legacy of slavery, oppression, and discrimination. The goalposts kept changing, redlining, funding schools by local property taxes, which is connected to redlining, of course, lack of opportunities, Darwin's perspective, right? This idea of the fittest will survive, those who, the cream of the crop, right? This idea of the meritocracy is grounded and rooted in these types of perspectives. We have people saying school districts being inadequately funded. Fatherless family was prominent, social stratification, marginalization of Black and brown indigenous people, the Black family being destroyed, okay? Intergenerational trauma, voted for Democrats, ingrained in systemic racism, built-in institutional racism, right? And so as we look at these types of responses, right? So we got one group of responses that centered the problem with the people themselves, right? Centered the problem with Black people. Black people became the center of the analysis in terms of what Black people aren't doing, what Black people don't value, versus us taking a zooming out, right? To look at the conditions that actually created these realities that we experience to this day. And ultimately, as many of you have said here, it goes back to the long history of racism and white supremacy that is woven into the very fiber of our social, political, and social and economic structure in this society. And I must tell you, you know, as an educator for over 20 years working in schools, in marginalized communities, schools where the majority of the students receive free and reduced lunch, these are called Title I schools. A lot of time and energy is focused on statistics like these, focused on analyzing why it is that we have this gap between the educational achievement of white and Black students. And in discussing the gap, quite honestly, most of the time, the conversation fails to address a lot of the things that you guys have put here in the chat. So at this particular point, I really feel like I'm kind of speaking to the choir. I do have some allies here, or what Bettina Love characterizes as co-conspirators here in this space. And so it does make it a little bit less my job to have to convince you of the fact that the causal reason is definitely rooted in the history of racism and white supremacy that guide the educational, continue to guide the educational policy and practices of this nation. And so this is what I did here. I created this graphic to kind of conceptualize what it is I'm talking about here. And we're going to go a little bit deeper in terms of looking at these disparities, all right? Let's see if I can, okay. So this graphic here, right? So we're talking about this achievement gap. So I use a tree intentionally, right? Really it's a tree, or you can characterize it as a bush, however you want to look at it, right? And so you see right there in the leaves, right, of the tree, you have this outcome of the achievement gap. You have this outcome, the realities or the statistics that I just shared with you. And so when we talk about addressing the achievement gap, a lot of the conversation that I've experienced as an educator has been focused on things that kind of are going around the bush, right? And I call it beating around the bush, right? So when we talk about the achievement gap, we look at these things and we look at these statistics, some people say, well, the solution is the fact that the teachers just aren't teaching properly, right? So what we need to do is we need to give teachers a scripted curriculum, right? Meaning that teachers need a script. They call them teacher-proof teaching, right? We're going to give them a script, and they have to read directly from the script to their students. That way we equalize what students are getting, right? Now, granted, these models, these reform models, are pretty much only implemented in schools that serve primarily students of color and poor students. So it's really not an equalizer, because you're getting a scripted curriculum that's focused on basic skills, where at the same time you have schools that are traditionally achieving in other elite upper middle class neighborhoods and areas that are not subjected to this curriculum. So even still, right, we're still facilitating a gap in achievement because of the type of curriculum that students are being exposed to, right? Another thing that comes up a lot is this whole idea of school uniforms, right? Put all these students in a uniform, right? You put them in a uniform, they'll be less concerned with what they have on and more concerned with education. We can improve the outcomes, decrease the achievement gap if we put them in uniforms, right? Again, this is one of the central arguments in cases. Teach the standards, right? So there are educational standards that have been outlined by the Department of Education that each state then adopts, and then the teachers are required to teach. So a lot of the achievement gap question has been around this whole idea of, are teachers really teaching the standards that they've been given, right? So again, we're talking about how this issue is being addressed, right? Increased rigor, right? The education the Black students are getting is not rigorous enough. That's why they're not achieving. The school culture and climate, there's too much, going on. We need to have these zero tolerance policies. We need to tell, have students walking in straight lines. These Black students need these stringent policies and procedures in place in order for them to learn. Another part of the argument has been that we need data-driven instruction. Let's just use data to drive what we're doing and what we're talking about. And so as we look at these things, right, that I've just displayed here, none of them directly address, right, what we see going on underneath, right, at the root of this particular problem of these disparities in education. And things you all have already mentioned in terms of racism, classism, sexism, materialism. These things in and of themselves, right, remain uninterrogated. We don't even, that doesn't even become part of the conversation when we begin to address the achievement gap. And this is part of the problem. This is the reason why over and over again for decades, we've seen these same statistics over and over again. And as a matter of fact, we've almost become used to them, right? When I show statistics like these, some people say, well, this is just, it's almost become like it's common sense. Of course, this is going to be the outcome, right? And we've accepted this as our reality. So when we talk about this whole idea of educational liberation, it requires us guys to tell the truth about the history that has created the current reality that we experience, right? And we have to be very honest about that history in order for us to move forward, all right? Now, so let's talk about this history for a moment, all right? Upon the founding of these United States of America, on the one hand, right, we extolled these ideals of liberty, freedom, and equality, right? Same things I was talking about earlier, this idea of, all men are created equal. These things were stated, right, written out in the founding documents of this nation. So on the one hand, we extolled these lofty ideals, but at the same time, right, we engaged in some of the most horrible actions against millions of people, right? The very land that we're sitting on is land that was obtained due to the cultural and physical genocide of the native people of this land, right? And then the individuals that were brought over here, Black people, were brought to the United States to work and as slaves in order to build this country, and the foundation of this country's wealth and advancement was built on the backs of Black people who were subjugated to these horrible acts. So how in the world, right? And sometimes I've asked myself this question, how do we justify the subjugation of a class and race of people, and at the same time, we extol these lofty principles, right? Well, what we do, guys, in order for this to happen, what we have to do is engage a process of miseducation and anti-socialization to create myths, stories, and narratives about the subjugated groups of people that would justify their treatment of them and in turn provide a rationale for their status. So the roots of miseducation in this country, right, or education for subjugation is grounded in a process of miseducation designed to justify the dehumanization of certain people for the material advancement of others, right? So we're talking about stories and being socialized and educated, where people begin to, where stories are created about who is human and who is not human, right? Stories about who is worthy and who is not worthy, who is intellectually inferior and who's superior, right? There's a long history in this country where elected officials, scientists, and thought leaders all proclaimed and published so-called facts about the inherent inferiority of Black people. This was part of the foundational knowledge base of this country. For example, there was a noted physician, Samuel A. Cartwright. He reported to the Medical Association of Louisiana in 1851. Listen to what he said. He published this to this medical association. He says that Black people had smaller brains and blood vessels and a tendency towards indolence and barbarism, right? So ideas like this were taught to both white and Black people alike, right? This same physician declared that the Negro slave withstood the rays of the sun better because of an eye feature like one found in apes, right? So we see this dehumanization, right? Wielding science, right? Many of this has been characterized as scientific racism, wielding science to substantiate these false claims as relates to the inherent inferiority of Black people. Even Thomas Jefferson himself, who on the one hand proclaimed that all men are created equal, proclaimed that Black people were dull and tasteless in their imagination and inferior in intellect, right? So we're talking about these narratives, these stories, this education, right, that created the ideology that substantiated the practices that you see in front of you on this screen today, right? And so these stories that I just relayed to you, and there are countless others, right, where all types of scientists and scholars were publishing information and grounding it within this idea of scientific fact of the inherent inferiority of Black people. And so these stories would create what Princeton scholar Dr. Ruha Benjamin characterizes as an elaborate ideological apparatus that justified the mistreatment of people of color and substantiated the ways in which they were exploited for the sake of economic and material gain for the elite class of white male landowners in this country. Over time, right, we're talking about ideology. Over time, this ideology or way of thinking or this way of knowing was concretized, and it was codified into laws and policies that govern the justice system, the educational system, healthcare, every other system of this country is informed by this ideology. And so the sacred art and science of education in and of itself, right, continues or was weaponized and continues to be weaponized to advance the interest of this ideology, which characterizes an ideology of white supremacy. So as we investigate or talk about this whole idea of educational liberation, it requires that we realize the fact that there is a history behind the statistics that we just read. There's a history behind the racial disparities that exist in education. Yes, laws have changed over time, but guys, we cannot legislate away ideology. And I found more often than not, when we raise history as a causal factor for the state of education, for any of these inequities that we witness in our lives, in our society, whenever history is raised, it's often deemed as an excuse, right? There are people say, well, you know, this was 400 years ago, right? We're free now. We had the civil rights movement. You know, we even had a Black president of the United States. So they'll, you know, bring up these things, right? You'll have people who actually migrated to the United States. They'll say, you know, I came here, I didn't know the language, I didn't have anything, you know, and I made it, you know, I'm successful. What's wrong with these people, right? So this becomes this way of thinking, right? Particularly when you raise this idea that history has a bearing on our current reality. And what I often do, or what I often offer when people raise that particular argument, is that when we bring up history, history is a point of analysis, a point of necessary analysis for us to diagnose our current condition. And I often give them this metaphor of a physician, right? And all of us have been to the doctor before, right? We may have a cough, for example, and we go into the office. They hand us the clipboard, and we have to fill out the information related to our symptoms, right? And so we fill out our name and all that personal information, and then there's a line that asks us, hey, describe your current symptoms. And in so doing, we tell them, I'm coughing, I've had a fever. So we describe the symptoms that we're experiencing. The next section of that paper will ask us to describe or give us some ideas about your medical history, right? And not only are we asked about our medical history, our own personal medical history, there's another section of that document that asks about the medical history of our family. Now, why is the physician asking us these questions? Not only about our current condition, it seems like they should be only concerned with our current condition, but they're asking us about these historical implications for our health, because that's going to provide them with a point of analysis that will help them to better administer to our current need, right? And so when we talk about this idea of history, right, and how it has shaped our current reality, it's important that we understand and we don't allow ourselves to buy into the idea or this ahistorical idea that, hey, history doesn't matter, it's all good now, right? That's a very, very dangerous space to be, particularly when we look at creating or call ourselves individuals who are committed to creating a better world. And in addition, right, I also offer, or I feel like it's beneficial not only, to offer that particular metaphor, but actually look at some actual numbers, right? So let's look at some of the medical history, the cultural, what I'm calling the cultural medical history of the United States, right? So we go back to the year 1619, right? Actually, we can go all the way back to 1492 when we begin to look at what had happened to our native brothers and sisters in this land as they experienced cultural and physical genocide and being ripped and robbed of their land. But I'm going to go here to 1619. This is the year the first enslaved Africans were brought to the United States, right? And we're talking about this history of miseducation. There was a deliberate and intentional process put in place to dehumanize and deculturize the African to make him or her into a slave. It's important for us to remember here, right, that they didn't steal slaves from Africa. They stole scientists. They stole doctors, architects, astronomers, and teachers who were made into slaves. The education, or should I say the miseducation that they experienced, or the miseducation process, actually started here. This is the origin, 1619, of the achievement gap that we've been talking about, the origin of the inequities that we looked at in those statistics. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Many of us are taught in schools that the Civil War was fought in order to free the slaves. Again, we must understand that there's never been a war fought on American soil for the expressed or the sole purpose of liberating Black people, right? But we had the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed in 1863. In 1865, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution was ratified, right? That amendment states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So it's very important that we even pay attention to the wording of that particular amendment, right? Particularly as we look at the history of the criminalization of Black people, particularly Black males in this country, right? So we look at this history, right? We went from enslavement, right? Then we get this period, or we have the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment being passed, but the wording of the 13th Amendment speaks to the fact that slavery is abolished except when you are convicted of a crime, which means that then if I can criminalize your behavior, or even, and on top of that, if I can convince you, right, that to be Black is to be criminal, then I can put social mechanisms in place, institutions in place to relegate you to a place of disenfranchisement right? Where then the, many people only find their ability to succeed or to get ahead is through doing certain things or that are criminally inclined. Then I put you in jail, and then again, you become my slave, right? And then we look at the privatization of prisons, where we have people who are actually profiting off of the dysfunctionality of the Black community, all right? And so it's important, again, that we understand the dynamics of all of this, right? And we got to understand, right, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, right? So we look at these numbers here, right? We look at 246 years of enslavement, all right, 1619 to 1863. 1863 to 1964, we look at another 101 years of limited rights, okay? Now, nobody hit a reset button in 1964, right, to level the playing field, right? Because I often ask, from 1619 to 1863, how much wealth was being accumulated by Black people in America, right? How much wealth were accumulating versus the wealth that was being accumulated by white people, right? And so no reset button was hit. There was no redistribution of resources, no reparations as it relates to leveling the playing field. So 246 years of enslavement, 101 years of limited rights. Now we find ourselves in the year 2020, and we're looking at perhaps 56 years of so-called equality, right? And so we weigh these numbers, we weigh this historical reality against our current reality, and it will begin to help us to get a perspective for how our society got to be this way, right? This is very, very important. And so not only, right, us here currently, we inherited an unequal society, right? No one on this call is 400 or 500 years old. So no, we weren't here to perpetuate these things, but in essence, we are inheritors of this unequal system. And on top of that, what's even more critical is the fact that we inherited certain ways of thinking, racialized ideas and beliefs and assumptions as a result of this period of history where these ideas were being cultivated and advanced. So when we begin to analyze inequities in education, when we begin to analyze the need for educational liberation, we have to recognize the ways that racism structures our thinking and the functioning that it has within our institutions, right? So now, this is a long quotation, but I really feel it points to what I'm really attempting to relate to today, right? And so let's read this. Paulo Freire, in a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he says this. He said, a rigid and oppressive social structure necessarily influences the institutions of child rearing and education within that structure. These institutions pattern their action after the style of the structure and transmit the myths of the latter. Homes and schools, from nurseries to universities, exist not in the abstract, but in time and space. Within the structures of domination, they function largely as agencies which prepare the invaders for the future, right? And so I think this statement here has very, very deep implications for what we're talking about here today in terms of schools being this agent of social reproduction that reproduces the ideas and that support the structures that maintain the status quo, right? And these structures, as we know, have a long history in this particular country, which we've looked at thus far, all right? So here's the way I conceptualize it, right? So we're talking about us inheriting this racist ideology, or racial ideology that's rooted in white supremacy, right? This ideology has created certain narratives or ways that we view and approach our world, right? It's like this distorted reality. Our mindset is rooted within this, the way this ideology has impacted the way that we function. These narratives then impact the design of not only our educational system, but every other system that governs our lives in this country, right? So ideas lead to stories and narratives. These stories and narratives then contribute to the ways that we design our structures and institutions. That design then, when we're looking at education in particular, we're talking about educational policy, we're talking about curriculum, right? Then that design then informs our actions, right? What we do, the actions we take, right? Within these institutions, those actions then ultimately determine what the outcomes are. So at the root of it all is ideology, right? And the outcome of that ideology is the current reality that we experience. So I want to drive the point a little deeper with this particular illustration here. I referenced Dr. Ruha Benjamin a little earlier. I was listening to a talk that she was doing called "Schools as Laboratories for Social Change," and she often uses this image here as a metaphor in explaining the ways that our systems are designed. And so she tells a story. She lives in the Northeast, of course, and so she had an opportunity to go into to Southern California, right? And so she was in Southern California doing some work, and she said she was, in between meetings, and she decided to take a walk, and she came across a park where there was a bench like this in that particular park. And because she had been in this cold environment, she wanted to come and kind of lay out and get some sunshine, lay out and relax on this bench. However, she discovered that she was not able to lay down and stretch out on this bench, right? And the reason she wasn't able to do that is because of the armrest that's there on the bench. Now, with all of us here looking at this bench, right, to outward seeming, this is a bench, that you can sit on, and the railings that are there kind of serve a functional purpose, right? So one purpose could be, preventing us from being stuck to the person next to us, right? So it creates like a little barrier between. The other function could be, providing an armrest, right, for us to be able to sit back and rest our arms on. And so, again, looking at this, it is just a bench. But upon closer analysis, she says she discovered that around this area where this park was a place that was there was a lot of renovation happening, right? This is a newly kind of gentrified area where certain shops and things were being built around this park. And this park, or this area, was one that was once known to have a homeless population congregating around it. And so in essence, right, the bench no longer became just a bench with an armrest, but it actually was a bench that was designed to prevent homeless people from being able to lay down and relax on this park. And so what she did, she talks about this whole idea of that the way that this bench was engineered, right? The very engineering of this bench was discriminatory in terms of its design to keep homeless people out of this park, right? And so it was really riveting, right, when we begin to look at this whole idea of a discriminatory design. So what implications then does this have for education, right? And so as I, consider this this metaphor that she gave, or this illustration, it caused me to ask the question to myself in terms of education, particularly when we talk about education for liberation, asking ourselves currently, who is benefiting from the current design of education, right? What is it about this design of education that perpetuates inequities in student achievement, right? Who is not benefiting from the design? Now, notice that this question is a lot different from those that are typically asked, right? Because the question that's typically asked have to do with, what's wrong with the people, right? What's wrong with those who can't seem to succeed within the structure as it currently exists? And a lot of the conversation is about how do we fix the people as opposed to how we fix the design, right? So the point of analysis has been the people and not the design. And if that's the point of analysis, the people, then we'll fail to interrogate the system that perpetuate these things, and then we begin to see the same things happen over and over and over again. One of the agents of one of the functions of hegemony is to keep us distracted, right? Distracting us from the real problem, so that then the problem perpetuates itself and the status quo is maintained. So again, these questions that I'm asking here are fundamentally different. All right, so we begin to look at the inequities. We look at this whole idea of education for subjugation. Right, it's important that we understand, right, that urban schools are not broken. They are simply doing exactly what they are designed to do. All right, and that comes from The Art of Critical Pedagogy by Jeff Duncan and Ernest Morrell. Right, and so again, there's this question, or we're bringing to the fore this whole idea of the design versus what's wrong with the people, right? Because ultimately, what we are taught in our system of education teaches us, and the platitudes and sloganizing that occur in this nation in terms of everyone having equal access, education being the great equalizer. It causes us to locate any problems, right? When we talk about failure, we talk about people that aren't succeeding in the sense of the way success has been characterized. The people are looked at as being deficit, right? And this is referred to as deficit thinking, right? Where when we begin to describe or try to describe what's happening around us, we say things such as, we look at the failure of students in school, particularly Black and brown students, that they fail in school because them and their families experience deficiencies that obstruct their learning, right? They have limited intelligence, lack of motivation, inadequate home socialization. Again, the lens being turned and focused on the people as opposed to being focused on the design and the need for us to transform our society, right? And so today, in this whole conversation that we're having about the education for liberation, what I'm challenging us to do is to turn the lens from the people and to locate the problem within the design itself, right? It's time for us to turn the lens and focus our attention on the systems and institutions that perpetuate these outcomes, right? And so this is when we begin to talk about the necessities for an education for liberation. So now that we've kind of looked at the problem, we've looked at the history that has created this, we looked at statistics that kind of define our current reality. Let's now look at, this whole idea of what the necessities are for an education for liberation. And so to answer this question, it requires us to revisit the purpose of education, all right? It requires us to reimagine how we do school, right? And then it requires us to take courageous action to do what's necessary to make education a means for the transformation of human consciousness, as well as a means for facilitating the social, ethical, and material advancement of our world. Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Bahá'í Faith, teaches us. He says that our current social order is lamentably defective. And for the past few minutes here, this is what I've been kind of focused on, the defectiveness, right, of our current social order. And so when we talk about the need for us to transform this order, Baha'u'llah teaches us as Baha'i that our job, this is our role, right? Our religion is a movement. The Baha'i Faith is a movement, right? And we're taught that in order to transform our current reality, this current order, we have to be about the business of creating a new world. And so in order for this to happen, it requires us to engage in a process of self-reflection where we look within our own selves, right? To understand how our own worldview has been shaped by this ideology that we've inherited, right? And we have to be okay with the fact, we have to acknowledge the fact that we are indeed infected, right? I've heard it put like this, there's a swimming pool or a body of water and you jump into the water, you can't get in the water or be in the water and not get wet, right? We can't be citizens of the United States of America and not be infected with these ideas, particularly as relates to race that constitutes the racial narratives that play out in our head. We're all infected by these things, right? And so we must first be honest about that. And then we have to have the courage and the creativity as we engage in our own process of transformation to then imagine and create new structures and new ways of going about functioning in our world, right? And oftentimes, guys, in conversations like these, we look at statistics like the ones I read earlier, we look at all the problems around us in our world, the disparities, the unrest, the various things that are going on in our world. A lot of times, in conversations I have, there's really like a lack of hope, right? You talk to people and, the overwhelming sentiment is, this is just the way it is, right? There's no way, this thing is too big for us to change. But as Baha'is, one of the things that Baha'u'llah has taught us is the power of us as individuals. When we begin as individuals to cultivate this consciousness within ourselves, this consciousness of the oneness of humankind, when we begin to build collective consciousness amongst our neighbors, friends, co-workers, we will then begin to, from the grassroots, be able to begin to influence entire communities and then influence entire institutions. And so this is the hope that I have. This is what motivates me and inspires me, knowing that this is not just the way it is, that we do have the power to change, right? Nothing is impossible. We have the power to create whatever it is that we want, right? If we invest the mental and intellectual energy into what we need to do, we can make a change. And so here, again, as we talk about an education for liberation, I want to offer this same conceptual model again, right? So we're starting with the level of ideology, right? Narratives, design, actions, and outcomes. So we talk about education for liberation, there must first of all be a shift in the ideology, right? That shift in ideology, or the change in ideology, will change the narratives or the stories that play out in our heads about society, about who people are, right? That then will then have implications for a shift in design, right? A shift or a total transformation or reordering of the design of how we do schooling, how we do criminal justice, how we do health, how we do housing. All of those things, those designs will begin to shift. When there's a design in this, a change in the design, a shift in the design, then there will be a shift or a change in the actions that we engage in, and then there will be different outcomes. So now, let's start at the level of ideology. Baha'u'llah teaches us, he says, "O children of men, know ye not why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your hearts how you were created. Since we have created you all from one same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land, that from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest," right? So now, when we look at this ideology compared to the ones we were discussing earlier that were designed to make people see themselves as different, right? White superiority, black inferiority, right? So that idea being that which was promulgated and informed the way that we did everything in our society. So what we're calling for now is a shift in ideology that's rooted in this idea or this spiritual truth that we were all created from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Then Baha'u'llah admonishes us, he says, "Ponder at all times in your heart how you were created," which means that whoever I meet, right? If I'm pondering how I was created, I'm seeing that, again, them as me. I'm seeing the God in them, right? I'm seeing them as a reflection of God, just as I see myself, right? And since we're all created from the same substance, it is incumbent upon us to be even as one soul, to think of one another as one human body, right? What affects one part of humanity affects all. So the idea, if we are invested with that idea, if this becomes a central part of our educational system, the way that we teach students from pre-K all the way in the university, this become a central part of that teaching, then what we'll begin to see is a shift in ideology, which becomes the root for everything else that comes as a result, right? So that ideological shift has to happen first, and it has to be rooted in the spiritual truth of the oneness of humanity, right? So now, as we adopt this, or we begin to cultivate this oneness consciousness within ourselves, right? Cultivate this oneness consciousness within students, right? Then what will begin to happen is our narratives will begin to change, right? So we begin to look at some of the things I shared earlier in terms of this body of knowledge that situated Black people as intellectually inferior, as lazy, and all these other things, right? The narrative began to shift when we began to see mankind or humankind being all created from the same dust in the image and likeness of one creator. The narrative switches from one person being superior to one being inferior to one in which we see man as a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. Now notice here, Baha'u'llah didn't say white man is minds rich in gems. He didn't say able-bodied or rich men, right? It says regard all men, right, as minds rich in gems of inestimable value. Now, education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. Now, when I look at this history, the things that we've been talking about before, this history of miseducation, people don't realize, right? Those who sit in positions of power, of influence, of making policy, don't realize that the subjugation of any one group of people actually negatively impacts humanity as a whole, right? Of course, we have obvious victims of racism, obvious victims of miseducation, where we see back, people who are relegated to, improper housing and lack of employment opportunities and all these types of things. But in essence, ultimately, we all suffer when any part of humanity suffers. And we see the importance of education here as it relates to us being able to benefit from the gems of inestimable value that are present within all people, right? And so now, when we look at this particular narrative and this particular purpose of education, of being one, education, a means to cultivate the gems that exist within all people, I couldn't help but to compare this purpose to the current purpose of the United States, education in the United States, right? Now, if you go to the Department of Education's website, right, for the United States, the mission as it's currently written, the mission says this right here. It says the U.S. Education Department's mission is to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access. So this is the purpose of education as outlined by the United States Department of Education. Now, I don't know about you, as I read this particular purpose of education, this mission statement, the things that stand out to me, or the thing that stands out to me most, is this whole idea of preparation for global competitiveness, right? And so when I look at that, and I see this emphasis on competition, what the mission statement suggests to me is that students learn for the sake of competing, for the sake of setting themselves up to be more successful than others. Because what's the definition of competitiveness? All right, I just want us to look at this. Right, this is the current paradigm from which our current educational system operates. Right, and competitiveness simply means this: a possession of a strong desire to be more successful than others. Right, and so now if we go on to look at some of the synonyms for compete, we see words like battle, challenge, clash, contend, vie, wrestle, spar, right? So all of these words that, really aren't aligned to facilitating the oneness of humanity, is more so attempting to really, or the antithesis of the quotation that we read earlier in terms of us seeing each other created as the same dust or from one substance, to seeing ourselves or trying to separate ourselves or be more successful than other people, as opposed to seeing how we can make our society more equitable and just, right? And so what I'm asking us or encouraging us to do in terms of, as we're looking at this whole idea of educational liberation, we have to make sure that we critically analyze the current paradigms that guide, our practices, particularly as we look at, what we're doing as it relates to education, right? So this is what Baha'u'llah says, right? Baha'u'llah says, as opposed to education being situated as a means for us to be global competitors, he says the purpose of learning should be the promotion of the welfare of the people. Now, we look at this, right? Where does competition fit into this? Where does me vying, fighting, battling for position, for power fall into this particular conceptualization, right? So we're talking about repurposing education. The purpose of learning should be the promotion of the welfare of the people. True learning is that which is conducive to the well-being of the world not to pride and self-conceit, or to tyranny, violence, and pillage. You know, Bahá'í teaches us that, he says that man's merit lieth in service and virtue, and not in the pageantry of wealth and riches. And so when we look at this education paradigm that our current paradigm operates under, is situated within this space of individualism, right, versus the promotion of the welfare of the people, is rooted in this obtaining of material wealth, power, and these types of things, versus us using educational learning being that which facilitates the welfare of all people. All right, and I'm going to go past these couple of quotations. All right, and so now we've addressed the ideology, we looked at narratives. Now we're going to look at design. I just want to offer this quotation here as relates to how we must begin to design the way we do school in order to create the outcomes that we want, right? And so it says here, schooling must be recast in ways that focus teaching and learning on the elevation of human consciousness and the promotion of justice versus the mere advancement of material and technology, right? And so as concerned as we are, right, with that element, and as much financial resources and intellectual resources we invest in that aspect of learning and development, we must also devote the same type of energy when we talk about how we create a society that's more equitable and just. So this brings me now finally to the actions, right? So when we have this idea of the oneness of humanity as the ideological framework that frames our approach to how we teach kids, right? How we teach, you know, our own kids, even outside of school, right? In our communities. So this ideology of oneness kind of shaping that, right? And then that then impacts the narratives or the ways that we go about talking about our society, analyzing our society, looking at who people are and the inherent gems and the inherent things that they have to offer to our world. And then we narrow that down then to the design, which then characterizes the actions. And so here are some actions that I want to offer as we begin to look at the necessities for creating education for liberation. One of the actions that I want to offer in terms of creating this new framework for education is a strong social and emotional learning component, right? Students must be, we must build empathy within our students just as much as we build their intelligence and knowledge of scientific facts, right? And so building that empathy and helping them to see themselves as part of a community, knowing that their actions impact everyone around them, not only themselves, and seeing themselves as part of one human family is a central part of this social and emotional learning, right? Knowing that my interests are connected to the interests of the community. The other thing is culturally responsive teaching, right? A lot of our teaching, when we talk about miseducation, education for subjugation, a lot of the information that we receive in schools is given to us from one perspective. And most of the time, this is from a Western perspective as it relates to the ways that we do school, right? And so schooling must be responsive to the cultural knowledge, responsive to the needs of students from various cultures, and not just engaged from one particular way of thinking, right? Social literacy, we must help the students to develop tools and capacities, habits of mind, because we're talking about rearing students, rearing children who will then take the reins of our social institutions, right? And it's important that as they do, they are informed by this idea of oneness, informed by community, and they're able to detect and read reality in certain ways where they can detect inequities, they can detect ways in which they need to do things differently to make sure that, you know, different voices are heard or different people are included. And so that comes with this social literacy, or giving them opportunity to develop their ability to read their reality through the eyes of oneness. The other element of this is historical literacy, right? Some of that we engaged in a little bit earlier today. which means understanding the way that history has shaped our current reality, right? Because the analysis that we have, right, will impact or has a bearing on the type of diagnosis that we give, right? So when we understand the roots of the problem, we understand the roots of the inequities that we see, we understand the roots of all the ills that we see around us, then we're able to more readily address them with solutions that are lasting, right? And that requires us to have a historical perspective and be able to understand how history has created our current reality. Another aspect of it, project and inquiry-based learning, all right? Giving students the opportunity, right, to be able to name and identify the problems around them in their community, and then use their schooling or apply certain academic principles to solving those problems, right? Applying their ability to read reality, applying this lens of oneness to solving problems in their community. This, again, is another action that Education for Liberation requires. Service learning, giving students an opportunity to serve, right? To see their learning connected to the advancement of the society around them. No more can learning be situated in this paradigm of I'm going to school, I'm doing these things for my own material advancement, right? This whole individualistic paradigm that we're fed. Education must be seen as a means for me to transform myself and to transform my community. And we have to give students the opportunity when we begin to look at this whole idea of education for liberation, an opportunity to apply those types of things in their community, right? And again, this goes on to engagement in community projects, internships, digital simulations, right? We have to begin to expand the scope of curriculum, expand the scope of what we expose students to. We have the, right here at our fingertips with the internet, the ability to connect students with people all around the world, right? To hear their voices, right? To even sit, like how we are now in this Zoom call, individuals can interact and that kind of thing. And so when we talk about education for liberation, it's important that we provide students with these types of opportunities and we take these types of actions in order to begin to facilitate a different type of outcome. And again, all students have to be exposed to this, this way of teaching and learning. And so here the model that I showed earlier, which show all of the ways that we typically address social issues, the disparities in education and this whole idea of miseducation. Now you can see there's a different conceptualization here that we have, that when the roots of our educational system are grounded in ideas or spiritual truths of oneness, justice, the complementarity of science and religion, we see the leaves of our tree, or the outcomes, right, becomes the spiritual and material advancement for all versus a select few, right? Where we don't see these disparities where some achieve and some don't. Some have access to jobs, some don't. Some have access to adequate housing, some don't. Some have access to adequate health care, some don't, right? So when we are grounded or rooting our educational system within this paradigm, we will begin to see different results. And you see outside here, we're watering our tree with these various things here, right? We're reflecting on our practices continuously so that as we reflect, we refine them and we do them better, right? And we continue on this process of action and reflection to ultimately cultivate students and cultivate a world simultaneously that looks a lot different than the one that we currently inhabit, right? And so that's what I mean in terms of an education for liberation, of freedom for all of us from the vices that we've been locked in for far too long, from the vices that have kept us or kept women subjugated, kept people of color disenfranchised, right? Certain poor people, these extremes of wealth and poverty, all these things that we see around us. Education has a central role to play if it's rooted within the right paradigm to create outcomes that are beneficial for all of humanity. And I want to leave you or conclude with this particular quotation here, right? And you see this sculptor that's sculpting this pot here, and it says, you know, a new design. All right, education for liberation requires us to have a new design for what we're doing. And so what I'm encouraging us to do at the grassroots level, right? We can do this in our own neighborhoods at this particular point, right? Because it's going to be a while before our public school system that's locked within certain ways of doing things, certain paradigms. You know, truthfully, I don't really see that there's any reforming of our current order, right? It's so lamentably defective that it's going to require us to build anew. And so that's what I'm, you know, devoting my life to. And this is what the perspective that the Baha'i teachings give us is a framework for making that happen, right? With oneness being the pivot around which we create these new systems for how we do things, right? And so in closing, this quote here, it says that we want different learning and life outcomes for students. And I'll add there, if we want a better world, we actually have to design for them, right? And so thank you for your time today. And I think at this point, I'm gonna open it up for some conversation, question and answer. And so I turn it back over to Paymane.
Yes, thank you so much for that really eye-opening look at, you know, how education has kind of been co-opted by these dominant oppressive structures and narratives, and how that really contrasts with the Baha'i view of education as an empowering and equalizing force. So yeah, we'd love to open up for some questions now. You can either put your question in the chat and I'll read it out in the order that it's received, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand button, which you can find by clicking participants and then the buttons in blue. So we already have a couple questions. Okay, the first one is from Brendan. Thanks for speaking. There are certainly a lot of racial issues with our current educational system. Over the past few decades, there's been a major inflation of college tuition. It seems like our education system may be contributing to the wealth gap. And since the African American community is already suffering more from poverty, they may be more impacted by this. How much of the racial inequity in education do you think has to do with the financial burden of education?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, and I just, you know, I could take that question back to my own life. You know, as a kid growing up, I grew up for some part on the west side of Atlanta, Georgia, in a very, you know, the zip code 30316. If you look that up, you'll see some of the realities of that particular area. But I remember growing up, and, you know, I would see people going off to college, and just, you know, in my mind, it was, you know, I could never do this because I couldn't afford to do it, right? You see people going off to, you know, dormitories and, you know, paying tuition, all these types of things. And so that in and of itself can have a psychological impact based on the way our society is structured, in terms of even the, you know, having the, you know, the confidence that you are able to actually to do that, all right? And so absolutely, the way that our society is structured in terms of access to education, particularly access to higher education, and the you know, the expenses associated with it, the inequities in wealth definitely have a bearing on inequities in access as relates to accessing college education. So that's definitely a part of the equation, right? And a part of this, and that's why it's important that we look at inequities in any one space, right? We look at education and healthcare, inequities in education, inequities in housing, whatever we look at, all right, there's this intersectionality, right, as relates to the other inequities that exist in our society, right? So we can't just isolate one without looking at the context of the others, because all of these things are contextualized within an entire system of inequities that create certain outcomes for certain people.
Our next question is from Noreen. Do you have any thoughts on the concept of white grievance? Is it a serious block to progress? And how can we help people overcome the feeling of white grievance and superiority?
All right, talk to me a little bit about white grievance. Whoever posed that question, talk to me a little bit about what you are.
I will unmute you, Noreen, in case you want to expand on that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So yeah, I've been hearing this term of white grievance. And I heard it in relation to a political, but it's also kind of a grassroots, I think, of white people being made to feel like you're taking advantage of us. You're like pulling the race card and using that to get what is rightfully ours. So it kind of ties in with the whole white supremacy, but now it's making people feel like, well, hey, yeah, I deserve this, and who are they to take it from me? Does that make sense?
Right. Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. So there's this whole narrative or way of this ideology that's prevalent right now in terms of, particularly in our political structure of this, and it actually started, we saw it really evident during the administration of Barack Obama, right? We had this Black president, and we began to see this emergence of sentiment of people feeling like they're losing their country, right? We start hearing things like, we need to, take our country back, right? Or this mantra now that we're hearing of "Make America Great Again," and so all of this is fueling this idea of, or the idea that white people, this country is for white people and built for white people, right? And the things that have happened here are a direct result of the efforts that white people have engaged in to make it what it is. And everything that the current order has been earned. Those who are on top or those who are in control have earned that control, right? And so what that does is negates the very same things that we were talking about during the beginning of this presentation, is how the history of genocide, history of pillage, history of oppression, history of institutionalized racism that has created, right? So, if you make somebody, it's very simple, right? If I move into your house, right, and I take over your business, and I first of all steal your business or industry from you, and tell everybody I discovered it, right? And then not only that, I make you work for me there, and I don't pay you any money. Of course, what's going to happen is I'm going to accumulate a great deal of wealth, and subsequently, you're going to find yourself poor, disenfranchised, right? And I do this over several generations, right? 400 years, right? When we talk about, when we really look at it, right? We look at, 246 odd years of, actual chattel slavery, but we look at the years of racism and de jure and de facto segregation, all those things that were present within our society. Then we begin to see that no, this was not earned. This was not by merit. This was by force. This was by domination and colonialism. This is how these things happen. And so, we have to begin to address or make sure that we raise our voices when we hear these sentiments raised, to begin to point out some of these realities. And I hope today, I've offered you some ammunition in terms of making that happen. For example, just showing people the numbers, right? We look at 1619 to 2020, 1964 to 2020, talking about 56 years of so-called equality, and the playing field is supposed to be level. I'm supposed to be, the masses of Black people should be, so everything should be, the same, where everything is okay. No, that was a tremendous head start that white America had, and then there are systems in place that maintain that because they perpetuate an ideology or ideas that keep the status quo in place. And so, it's important that we speak back to any type of sentiment that that suggests that this society was built and white people earned the status that they currently have.
Next question is from Philip. When I taught English at a Catholic girls' school in Ecuador, I was amazed at my junior high school students' desire to help each other pass the class, even to the extreme of helping them cheat on exams. How can we harness this desire for universal well-being in an academic setting?
Right. This is very, very essential, right? When we begin to talk about this shift from individualism to oneness, right? A lot of times, again, when we talk about the ideology and the paradigms that we operate from, the Western paradigm privileges or really the individual is highlighted, self-made person, right? I did this by myself. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. So this idea of individualism is rooted within the Western ideological way of looking at life. And when we look at this whole idea of community, it does not jive with that, right? So this is when you see, I remember from the earliest days in school where, you're taught, hey, look on your own paper, right? Keep your paper covered. This is your space, right? Versus this nurturing a feeling of community, or this aesthetic of community within this ethic of community within your classroom space. And so I think it's essential when we talk about social emotional learning being central to what we do with students in terms of helping them to see themselves as part of a community, right? And it starts right there in the classroom. If I can begin to see my classmates as part of a community, I see my school community, right? If this is a microcosm of the world, should we not be cultivating those same thoughts and sentiments within if that's what we really want, right? And that goes back, right, to our current system. Is there a will for there to be an outcome of oneness? Do we have the will to educate all students the same, right? And so the question of will has to be central. And when we cannot find that, when the will is situated in maintaining the status quo, the will is situated in keeping certain groups marginalized and kept out of certain ways of life, then it becomes necessary for us to create something different. And it's central, or is essentially necessary for us to begin to provide experiences for students to work together cooperatively. And we see remnants of that, right, in this whole idea of 21st century learning, right, where a lot of people that are not familiar with 21st century learning, it's the skills that are going to be necessary in the new economy. And one of the things that is upheld within that is this whole idea of being able to work together as a team and cultivating these interpersonal relationships. However, at the end of the day, the goal of that is rooted still in material gain and material advancement, and not necessarily rooted in us re-engineering a society that operates under those same principles. They found that more cooperation actually increases productivity and efficiency for business, right? But it's not being necessarily looked at it with respect to cultivating a society that's more equitable and just. So we have to make sure that our ideas of cooperation are rooted in that space, and we're giving kids that particular centering, so that when they do engage in whatever they're engaging in, those cooperative activities, they're doing it from a pure spirit or a pure space.
I think we'll take one more question just in the interest of time. Laura asks, how did you become a Baha'i?
Oh, wow. I actually was raised in the Baptist church primarily. My granddad was a pastor. The church, my whole family went to the same church. And I always tell people, that's where I, first came to know God, in the Baptist church. And it was a traditional Southern Baptist church, right, where we, sing the hymns, the organ going, the drums going, this immense spirit that, as an adult, I'm able to connect that spirit to that same spirit of my ancestors, right? The spirit of Africa, and not only that, connecting it to the spirit of those who were enslaved, who used hymns and songs and religion and faith as a means to survive. And so anyway, that's the tradition that I came from, and it is a deep part of who I am. Matter of fact, I might have started preaching a little bit as I was presenting today, but that's who I am. But I became exposed to the Baha'i teachings around the age of around maybe 13 years old, and began reading about the faith, and the whole idea of the oneness of religion really jived with me, right? Knowing that, this whole idea of progressive revelation, that all of the messengers came to advance one common cause, right? That really resonated with me. No matter if one was a Muslim or Christian, whoever you were, we were all worshiping the same God. And in 1993, I was actually joined the Baha'i Youth Workshop prior to becoming a Baha'i. The Baha'i Youth Workshop, performing arts, dancing and performing, and we would, proclaim the teachings of oneness and principles of justice through our performances. And I joined the workshop, and there was a conference that we had in Atlanta called the Fruit of the Holy Year Conference, where all of the workshops from across the country came to one space here in Atlanta. And it was at that conference that I declared. And so from that point, I've been working and striving to become a Baha'i, because we don't ever reach the point where we can truly claim to be a Baha'i. I feel, it's a constant striving, constant quest, particularly with some of the things that we've talked about now, right? With this racist ideology. Because I became a Baha'i doesn't mean that I automatically overcome certain ideas I have about folks, right? So it's a constant quest, and definitely a beautiful bounty to be part of this community, because it's framed the way that I do everything in my life. And so that's a kind of a little synopsis of how I became a Baha'i.
Great, thank you. So I just wanted to thank you again for such a thought-provoking talk, and hopefully we can all take these conversations back to our friends and family and share this video with people who couldn't come today. So yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely, thank you for having me.
So our speaker next week will be Tom Lysat, and his topic will be the Bab and Baha'u'llah and the 1848 Year of Revolution. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, so please invite your friends and family. Now we're going to close with a closing prayer.
Nothing should ever hurt me, no. Nothing should ever hurt me, no. Nothing should ever hurt me.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next Saturday.